Missionary Paul Finkenbinder, known as Hermano Pablo, began broadcasting Un Mensaje a la Conciencia, a message to the conscience, on the radio, just 4 minutes long, with a story followed by a moral and spiritual application. The story was attention-grabbing, so that you would want to listen to the rest, including the application, the spiritual application in particular. But it was so effective, it was also produced for television, such that last year alone, the donated airtime had a media value of over $100 million. We currently broadcast the program more than 6,000 times a day. That's why the media value is so high. The program is broadcast 250 times on 250 different radio or television stations somewhere in the Spanish-speaking world in more than 33 countries. That was my first introduction to the power of story. As a teenager in Colombia, listening to Hermano Pablo tell stories that captured my attention. And I knew instinctively, right off the bat, that was an effective way of evangelizing, of reaching people. So having that example, I wanted to also effectively communicate Christ with non-Christians as I became a missionary. I ended up writing my doctoral dissertation on the use of stories to communicate moral and spiritual values. And in the process of those studies, I remember thinking, especially in the study of entertainment education, how that there is a seminal soap opera in Latin America that is used for those who study that across the world now in communication programs, that I grew up listening to on the radio and then on television in Colombia. It's a story about a woman who migrates in Peru from a rural area to Lima, the capital. She learns to read and write. She becomes a successful seamstress and a fashion designer. And after months of the audience just wanting this to happen like crazy, she ends up marrying her literacy professor. The consequence of her story is that because she used a Singer sewing machine, product placement way back in the 60s, think about this. We thought it was something new in the 80s and 90s. No, back then, because she used a Singer sewing machine, and that was in part helpful for her success, Singer sewing machine stock was depleted in Peru during the time of the soap opera. There was such a significant demand for classes on sewing and literacy. They'd never had that happen before. Well, this was a soap opera. But the story grabbed people's attention. Now, if a story can be so powerful, even in its unintended consequences, how much more could stories followed by an application of the life-changing message of Christ? And that's exactly what we're trying to do. But I'm the opposite of the Hispanic here whose name is Francisco, and he says, "You can call me Frank," because he wants people to, I do the opposite. It's always been Carlos, not Charles. And it's Carlos Rey now. Charles Rey is my name in Spanish. Carlos Rey is just phonetically the equivalent. I've always done that to identify with Hispanics and their culture, studying their history, their literature, their authors, all of that, in part because las apariencias engañan, we say in Spanish. Appearances are deceiving. I can't help that I was born with this gringo facade, and that's just the way it is. 1 Corinthians 9, verses 19 through 23. Though I'm free and belong to no one, I've made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I'm not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I've become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do this all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. The emphasis that I'd like to leave with you is the phrase, I have become all things to all people. I think of that as the incarnation of the Apostle Paul. Remember he said, "Follow me as I follow Christ." One of the ways in which he was following Christ most effectively was to incarnate himself. Jesus became flesh. Paul became all things to all people. And he did so effectively. And you know what? We need to follow. I'm so convinced we need to do the same. It is so much easier not to identify with people sometimes, to cluster ourselves in our own spiritual nurseries, whether it be the four walls of a church or even at home, never getting to know our neighbors. It's so much easier, so much more comfortable to do that. Whereas Jesus did the opposite, and Paul followed his example in terms of identifying with people at their point of need, wherever they were, to the point of being criticized most severely for that, more than for anything else in his ministry. All things to all people. My goal is to identify with our audience, non-Christian audience, by the way, across the board, walking in their shoes as opposed to getting in their face. By telling stories about their cultural preferences, their pastimes, their hobbies, their sayings, their proverbs, their folklore, even patriotic and popular music. I've done a series on the national anthems of Latin America, a series on the top 20 pop songs of all time, after doing a survey and determining from our audience which those were. Dale Carnegie, on the subject of communication, never make a point without telling a story, nor tell a story without making a point. Each equally important. Those that are difficult to get to, sometimes it just takes identifying with them, incarnating yourself into their world. It may not be easy, but it is so worthwhile. To share with you my experiences, what I've found to be the most effective way to do it. And that's why I've resolved to always identify in all ways with all people, in all walks of life, walking with them in their shoes rather than simply preaching at them in their face, so all can hear the good news, although not all will be saved. Because just as we tell our stories with moral and spiritual applications, we're conscious of the fact that we are doing so to free moral agents. They can turn us down, and they do in large numbers. Not all will be saved, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to do my very best to walk in their shoes in order to reach them as effectively as possible. For just as we know that it's not religion that saves, but rather relationship with the one and only Savior, we must likewise cultivate relationships with people so they will want to cultivate a relationship with Christ.